Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. It's good to be back in the podcast chair. I'm sorry it's been so long, listeners, since we last recorded, but this is going to be a good one. I'm Darren. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. We've been catching up over the last several days, as so much has been going on in both of our lives, and it's great to get together with you and to share what's been going on with our listeners. So on that note, how have you been? How are things holding up? I know the weather has started to really change, and I've enjoyed that, getting that crisp coolness in the air. But how are things in your neck of the woods?
Things are good here. Unlike you, I was spared from some of the wrath of the Helene storm that came through not too long ago. I want to check in a second about that and your experience of that. But things here have been good. Like you say, I'm definitely also appreciating the shift in the seasons and having to turn the heater on for the first time, getting down into the high 30s in the evening. So yeah, things have been good for me, but I would love to have you check, and I'm sure our listeners are curious to know what your experience has been like. You were, of course, in Asheville, so you're right in the epicenter of the impact of the storm. I'd love to hear you reflect on what it's been like for you personally and what you've noticed about the community in general through the experience.
Yeah, I'm eager to share my experience. I think before I get into the detail, I just want to take a moment myself to kind of center my feelings on it, because there's been so much that has happened over the last 3 weeks that I was in some ways prepared for it, but in many ways you can never be prepared for something of this magnitude. First off, I want to say thank you to everybody that's reached out and wished me well, wished my family well. We all are doing fine. Everyone is healthy, and we survived the storm with minimal damage. House is basically fine. We're currently helping out my in-laws with some repair work that their house needs as a result of the floodwaters that came. But overall, they fared very, very well, and we're very grateful for the resources that we have and the network that we have. Our community here is also very strong. But it was incredibly intense, and it's something that I'm going to be dealing with, of course, for the rest of my life. These are events that really leave a mark on you and leave a mark on communities. Those of you who've been following the news, who have seen the images from Asheville, but also the Western North Carolina region, as well as other parts in Georgia and Florida, South Carolina, these are some harrowing images, for many. And to see them firsthand is incredibly shocking. I went to bed the Thursday night of the storm just sort of thinking it was going to be another heavy storm. We've had plenty of those. We get high winds here. I'm not unaccustomed to that. We have these very large oak trees around our house, and I always have to kind of keep an eye on them, making sure that they don't surprise me that there might be falling over. But they held up really well. But I can remember at 10:30 that night, my wife was checking the news, and she essentially decided to get her parents to come stay with us because they were in an area east of us that was within kind of a potential flood zone. And so she called them up. They were in bed at the time. She called them up, woke them up, had them come over to stay with us that night. And thank God that she did, because they would have had to battle their experience through that storm on top of their furniture in some instances. So really grateful that they were able to be with us that evening. And we woke up early. The power went out in the early morning hours. That woke both of us up because we have a generator that kicks on. So we fortunately have that as a resource to kind of give us power in these times of emergency situations. But I couldn't go to sleep. I couldn't go to sleep. And I did what a lot of people do. You pick up your phone, you start scrolling. Maybe I can read something that'll make me fall back asleep. But the storm was so intense that I just couldn't take my mind off of it. And so I reached out to people in the Asheville community via the Asheville subreddit just to try to get some connections there. And I started a Discord server for kind of the folks that were going through that. And really the intention behind that was I couldn't sleep, and I know others couldn't sleep because I was seeing them post on the subreddit. And I thought, this would be an easier way for us to have a conversation and share some of our feelings that are happening right now. And that ended up becoming very, very fruitful and a means for people across the region to stay connected and communicate in times of disruption. We had cellular service that was unreliable, internet went down, roads, essentially, some roads just don't exist anymore. Roads that I me and my family we take every single day just don't exist anymore. So the ways in which you would navigate your community and connect with other people and get to resources that you might need on a daily basis, those things were completely cut off. I was physically cut off the morning of the storm once it had passed, and kind of got out of the house and walked down the street to the front of the neighborhood. If you went left or you went right, we were locked in. The floodwaters had risen on both sides of the road that connects to our neighborhood. I ran into some neighbors from an adjoining neighborhood who said, "Oh, did you hear about so-and-so? They literally had to rescue him from his house as it was inundated by the floodwaters." These are things that were just happening in the early morning hours of that Friday. And to see the waters cresting and flooding over roads that I would take every day, roads that allow me to get to the rest of the city, and recognizing that I'm locked in, like that's an incredibly powerful experience. So, I could talk a lot more about it. Our community is very strong. Asheville and the other communities of the Appalachian region are very strong. There's a lot of effort underway now to do the repair, rebuilding. Huge shout out to all of these relief organizations that have arrived with resources and volunteers. FEMA, I've had nothing but a good experience with FEMA, and I've certainly not only experienced their help via virtual assistance, but also in person. So have a very good experience with them. But a lot of work remains to be done. I mean, we only recently got water back just a few days ago. Our internet is still down. I'm using a Starlink system, which I basically purchased from Atlanta, and then I picked it up in Atlanta and drove it back. So we're doing the podcast right now via the Starlink system. A harrowing experience, and one that reminded me a lot of things that you and I have talked about in many of our shows. And I know that our listeners as well are sensitive to these kinds of events. Many of our listeners have felt something within themselves that has said events like these are only going to be increasing, or the potential for these events is increasing. And I certainly have felt that. My body, in fact, felt to some degree a sense of foreboding before the storm even came. I was exhibiting high symptoms of anxiety before that Thursday night in the week preceding the storm. So much so that I went to my doctor and I was like, I'm feeling really overwhelmed. I'm uncomfortable, and can you just check on me? They did the checks and did the blood work, and like everything's fine. And then the storm came. And so I'm reconciling that experience as well. This almost like precognizance, this presentience of this event, and so feeling that trauma manifest itself in my body before the storm arose, and it's still inside my body now. I can feel it; it's still there. Important that we all develop practices to kind of process this kind of emotional energy, and we do that before these events happen. And I feel like I've done some of that, but it underlies the importance of that work even more. And so, I encourage our listeners, as I'm encouraging myself, to continue to do that work that needs to be done to remain as calm as you can in the midst of unexpected circumstances, so that you can navigate those experiences. And it's not something that I want people to numb what they feel. I don't want you to sort of pretend as if you're not feeling things. That's not really the opposite of what I would argue for. I think it's recognize that energy that is arising in you, be present to that energy, and allow it to move through you rather than fight against it. And it's that fighting of the energy that really often, I think, leads to the greatest amount of friction. And so a lot has been learned. In my personal experience, it definitely has brought to the forefront in my mind what potential future calamity might look like in a very, very real sense. We're making preparations for whatever might happen in the future, whether it be small or large. I mean, these are things that once you've had this experience, you and your community, you look at what you can do and you say, well, how can we do more? How can we be better prepared than we were this last time? And quite frankly, I felt I was pretty well prepared, but even then we can do more to be a resource, not only for yourself and your family, but those in your community that are close to you. So an incredibly powerful experience. a lot has left to be done, and the future ahead for this region is going to be filled with a lot of hard work. But the spirit here is very strong, and the people are very strong, and I'm looking forward to being part of that recovery effort. These moments of trauma, and you and I have talked about this, the powerful ability for trauma to be transformative. And what we want, I think, most of all is connection. And what I was encouraging people to do, what I discovered in my own experience, is that when you are, and you certainly have messaged this so often, and particularly with your Essence of Being class, when you are transparent and vulnerable, and I know vulnerable is a loaded term in our world today, but when you are being who you are with others and being present to others, you're creating invitations and opportunities for connection. And it's that connection that is so powerful and meaningful. And we live in a world where that connection is essentially kind of artificial. We think we're connecting, but it's not real. It's like fake, it's a fake sweetener. It's not the real thing. And so when these moments happen, whether you find yourself in the midst of an actual calamity, a natural disaster, or you're feeling that you're going through some sort of tumultuous time in your own life, that just things have changed and your circumstances are very stressful, my encouragement would be to be open and honest with those feelings, with those experiences, and to share those experiences with others that you are connected to, whether they be your neighbors or your family or your friends. Don't brush those moments of connection aside and say, everything's fine, I'm going to be okay, we're all good. And say, you know what, I am actually struggling, and how are you doing? And are you doing okay? Did you survive all right? And give opportunity for dialogue and conversation, because those connections are really where I think we find that power of the human spirit, and it manifests so very tangibly. We kind of tap into even our own higher selves in those moments. And you can feel it. You can feel it within your body that is almost your true purpose in the world. And so maybe get out from behind your screens and try to really connect with those who are closest to you, and you'll find something really meaningful in return.
Well said. And it's certainly compelling to hear you reflect on the experience. I think a firsthand experience like this, it comes across in how you share, even the energy that you're emitting as you talk about this experience, which I think people can grok and metabolize as well. So good lessons, and very pertinent and relevant, related to what we've talked about many times in this podcast. All right, so we're going to shift now to a couple things we want to do in the rest of the podcast. First of all, because it's been a while since we've done one, there have been some ongoing movement in the field in general in terms of this march towards disclosure. So we want to touch base on that, and then we're going to reflect on our experience reading Sekret Machines Part 3, War. This is the trilogy that Tom DeLonge and Peter Levenda put together. This is related to TTSA. It goes back several years. They now have recently published the third volume in the series. We both have some thoughts about that book, things we found compelling about it, and some things we found perhaps a bit limiting. But before we get there, Nathan, just want to turn it to you first. What are you hearing about what's coming up, and what are you excited about in terms of the potential move towards disclosure?
Yeah, it's it's interesting. As I was able to connect with the outside world, I would go to the top of the neighborhood where I actually had some cell service. So I'd check in on what was happening in the digital spaces and send out some messages. It was very obvious to me that this kind of threat narrative has become first and foremost in the discussion in the community, and that's, I think, brought on in part by Elizondo's book Imminent, that really kind of kickstarted the resurgence of that theme. But we're seeing that continue in various places in the community as well. Most recently, we heard from Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp that they feel like they are concerned for their own safety. And we certainly heard that from other pockets of those who've been outspoken for this subject as well. So that's interesting to me, that narrative is really kind of taking center stage at the moment. In the midst of everything else that is going on. So it's a lot of energy around danger, right? There's just danger all around us in the world, and in the world of ufology, or in the world period. We're in a heightened sense of danger and anxiety, I think. Immaculate Constellation. Of course, that was an interesting news nugget that came out recently. Has gotten a ton of attention, and the buzz is that that's really grabbed the attention of the gatekeepers, and maybe we've got them, scrambling to understand what how they're going to react to that, or maybe it's piqued the interest further from members of Congress who maybe have a place to actually go dig for that information. And that was, I think that came out through Michael Schellenberger's reporting. So interesting on that front. I get the sense that momentum is still happening, that there is still work being done very much behind the scenes, that the interest in Congress certainly isn't going away. I know we're going to talk a little bit about that at some point on the podcast today. But there's also so many other things, right? We have an election that's really right around the corner. I actually just voted yesterday, so kind of finished that, and that's very top of mind. All these things are wrapped up in this soup right now, and the soup feels a little spicy to me, Darren.
Indeed, the cauldron is boiling as we speak, no doubt. Yeah, as you pointed to, I've also been struck by just this sort of shift towards a threat narrative in terms of the dominant paradigm. I think that's kind of unfortunate. I've had some opportunity recently to speak with people that are coming from different points of view within ufology. And I've definitely, along with my colleagues, both with the John Mack Institute as well as Archives of the Impossible, tried to help them understand some of our perspective after having read so much material, so much of the literature, so much of the lore from experiencers over time. So both the Willie Strieber archives as well as the John Mack archives, both letters that were written to John as well as session transcripts of when people were working with John. And again, the overwhelming sense there is that we would say we still have research to conduct before we want to say this for sure, but our initial sense is probably 70 to 80% of even abduction experiencers come away with an overarchingly positive view of the experience when they have the benefit of time and perspective to look back on it. Which isn't to say, again, that it's not discombobulating and alarming and shocking, ontologically shocking, all those things. It almost always is that as well, because it is so outside the box of what we're used to expecting, and our evolutionarily derived physiology responds in certain ways. But again, when you have perspective, distance, to be able to look back at the thing, you realize it helped you develop a much more wide open and heartfelt kind of worldview. People no longer fear death. They don't look at material goods the same way. This is coming out of abduction experiences that are sometimes, including in this book we're going to discuss, kind of framed kind of narrowly. So I think as we think about what we should expect with disclosure, and even more so what we should expect in terms of eventually having direct contact with this intelligence, that we should keep in mind the things they've already been saying and the experiences that people have already had with these beings. Because again, when you listen to some of the military framing, you sometimes get the impression that we have no information, so we're filling it in with what could possibly go wrong, rather than looking at the glass as half full, considering what's already happened and how people have been overarchingly positively impacted by these experiences, even if they do include some alarming elements. So absolutely, I've noticed that as well. We, of course, have some hearings coming up, and Gillibrand, I think, is going to chair one of them, and we're going to hear from the new director of AARO. Interestingly, I have heard from some pretty top-level sources that they're cautiously optimistic about the shift in AARO since the Kirkpatrick era, that now there seems to be more openness and more of a diligent effort, a concerted effort to really gather material and try to get to the bottom of this, which is interesting because one of the notions that's been floated around is that the entire thing was a shell game. Basically, it was the DOD investigating the DOD just to try to bury this. But again, top-level sources of mine are saying that they are cautiously optimistic about the shift in AARO since the end of the Kirkpatrick era. We'll see what happens in this hearing, and if they just deflect and try to dismiss, we'll probably sense that we're exactly where we were before, but we'll keep an open mind and hope for the best there. Love to hear your take on that. The last thing I'll just introduce, and maybe you can reflect on this as well, is that we've got numerous films and series in the works. And I know that even from some of my conversations recently with some high-level people, there is this sense that media will play a major role in setting the scene so that disclosure can more easily happen. So sometimes we tend to think of these things as disconnected, but I'm very aware that some of these top-level people recognize that the soil is set up by media to help people understand that this is something that might happen. And even someone like Diana Pasulka has talked about human beings, after having watched a movie or read a book years later, don't actually easily differentiate between an actual experience that they've actually been through versus something they've heard about or read about, even if it's fiction. So absolutely, I think it's true that we seed the ground with these kinds of different works, and there are numerous ones about to be released. So we've got James Fox documentary, The Program, which is specifically talking about the reverse engineering program. George Knapp recently revealed that he's going to be in part of his own Netflix series. We've got Leslie Kane's series coming out from Netflix as well. So a lot of things happening there. And the last thing I want to quickly touch on before I turn it back to you was this Immaculate Constellation. As you say, that was a pretty big revelation and a sense that maybe we are cracking down to a deeper level now where some of the names and the nature of the gatekeeping is being exposed. And the notion there for those who are not aware is that not only was this basically a program that put together a database with really high-res footage and video and photos of craft and whatnot across the board. We've heard, tic-tacs, triangles, saucers, all of the usual shapes, really high-res stuff there is involved in this database. But even more so, the immaculate part has to do with the fact that they have been really instrumental in whenever any kind of information is leaked or any information or data is captured, where it's footage or whatever, or photos of these craft in different government circles, this group quickly swoops in, takes that information, that data, and takes it back into the Immaculate Constellation program, where it's put in one database centrally, where very, very few people have access, and cleans up the entire periphery of all the other databases so that these objects, these photos, this footage is not there, which again, some people have argued that this might be why Arrow partly didn't find things, because they're looking at all those other databases which have been scrubbed basically as part of this process.
Yeah, that's a truly fascinating alleged program there, and certainly hints at things that we've heard rumored in the community for some time, that there's this concerted effort to capture and segregate information from the mainstream. Of course, David Rush alluded to that as well. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays with the hearings that are coming up. I mean, what kind of individuals will be at these hearings? We've heard rumors that Elizondo might also testify. Of course, you mentioned the director of Arrow. Maybe we've got a new sort of face and a new sense of direction with that agency. I guess we'll see how that plays out in these hearings. And I think the tone and tenor will be interesting to observe in both the Senate and the House. I think we're having a hearing in each body, because the Senate has taken, I think, a more high-level, almost reserved view, and Gillibrand certainly has shifted her public stance and support of this kind of investigation. At least that's my perception, that her interest seems to have shifted to some degree. Whereas in the House, you've got a lot of members that seem particularly fired up and angry and want to get answers to questions. And here I'm thinking of people like your Tim Burchetts and your Nancy Maces and your Anna Paulina Lunas and potentially even Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. These are folks that have different reasons why they are upset with the government. Whether it be financial impropriety or just not being very transparent with the Congress, who has the responsibility to see some of these programs and oversee them. So really will be interesting what the coverage there is, what the questions are, and then what kind of comes out of that. And of course, you couple those hearings that are, I think, slated for November after the election, if I remember correctly. So you couple those experiences that will be very much publicized, I have no doubt. Couple that with these releases of these documentaries and films. These could kind of together create very powerful experiences for the American public. But I think, beyond the folks that will automatically be buying that content and tuning in, how much will it leak out into the public at large, and how much will that grab the attention of the public at large? It's truly odd, Darren, because I've witnessed, and you have too, so many times where we have even very prominent public personalities in the media space or in the entertainment space as well. Late night TV show hosts, for example, who are clearly very interested and in some cases very knowledgeable about the subject, who have guests on, they pose these questions and they get really interesting, tangible answers that there's something to this, and then the topic just kind of disappears again. And this is this ebb and flow that we've witnessed in the community for a very long time. When will it stop ebbing? When will it just kind of continue to flow? I think that will be interesting, and with a potential shift in administration, what kind of changes might come about there in the United States, and still we also might see some additional movement from other world governments. I mean, that's always a possibility that we'll get some additional sound bites or tidbits from those bodies. So yeah, very much looking forward to the fall. It's going to be a mixed bag. My gut tells me it's going to be a very tumultuous end of the year. For various reasons. So, folks, prepare yourselves is what I have to say about that.
Absolutely. And time will tell. And I agree with you that we've seen ebb and flow for sure. I will say as a final comment before we transition to the book review here, that again, fairly high-level sources I've spoken to seem more optimistic than I've seen them before in terms of where they think things are going. And of course, one part that we haven't mentioned yet that might be a big part of that process and that breakthrough is that numerous other whistleblowers are coming forward. I think also there's more work being done behind the scenes to allow whistleblowers who maybe don't trust Arrow, and even Michael Schellenberger interestingly said he doesn't particularly trust even the ICIG process. So there are other machinations in play where people would come through Congress people directly. So my sense is that there are really high-level whistleblowers right on the sidelines ready to testify as long as they can be assured of their protection, their security for their families and their own health and well-being. Because as you pointed out, and I mentioned it a bit as well, some high-level people, both journalists and ex-government people, have had actual threats against their lives bandied about recently. So as people within the community like to point out, though, that's when you know you're over the target, when the fuss is to tell. So the sense is that the gatekeepers are scrambling. My sense, even in some of my recent conversations with some of these high-level people, is that the tide is turning, that at some point, even these gatekeepers will look at the winds of change and recognize they're quickly going to be on the wrong side of history and are perhaps already scrambling to think about how they can mitigate damage to themselves based on what they know and what they've been a part of. So I know some of these high-level people fully support a truth and reconciliation process. They see it as being central to what needs to happen in order for us to finally get past this dark history in our government. So we shall see things look more optimistic than they have for a while, though. I'll say that as we shift here. All right, so we're going to be talking about another of these books that's pretty important. So you mentioned earlier Lou's book, Imminent. That's made a dent in the scene, you could argue, and we saw Lou being interviewed on various conventional news sources, mainstream news sources and whatnot. Certainly seemed to move the needle a little bit in terms of the public conversation. This book we're going to discuss today is less of that kind of book. It's more like a book for insiders who are richly involved in this field, and both DeLonge and Levenda are doing a much deeper dive into the undercurrent of what might be happening that is giving rise to what we perceive as the UFO phenomenon. So it's well beyond, is there a there there? There's a sense that there is a there there. What ultimately might be going on behind the scenes, even amongst an intelligence that is not visible on the scene, but might be controlling things sort of behind the scenes. Let me just quickly read a quick introduction to describing the overarching themes that were explored in this series, and then we can riff back and forth a little bit about some of our initial impressions of the book. So just to remind people, Sekret Machines is a 3-part series. So we before had the other 2 books. This volume 3 was just recently released. This is co-authored by Tom DeLonge and Peter Levenda, although I will make the point that it's mostly Peter Levenda that's doing the writing, and I definitely pick up a Levenda-esque kind of treatment of this topic that very much follows in the footsteps of his other series, Sinister Forces. This series explores the connection between humanity, advanced technology, and unidentified aerial phenomena, tying these themes into a larger narrative involving history, religion, and secret government programs. That's the scope of the entire series. In Volume 3, War, the book delves into the impact of war and conflict on the human race, suggesting that much of human history, particularly its wars, has been influenced or shaped by non-human entities or advanced intelligence. So here we're talking about even scriptural history, and the notion of wars that happen between nations or between gods might have been actually directed by some of these intelligences. The book investigates the role of secret military technologies as well, the manipulation of human beliefs, and the hidden knowledge that powerful institutions have kept from the public. It questions whether these conflicts have been guided by a larger cosmic agenda beyond human comprehension. So that's a description of the overall themes and a little bit more specifics about what this book went into. Before we get into sort of a not quite chapter by chapter, but section by section kind of analysis, I'm curious for your initial thoughts on this book, maybe what you were expecting and whether or not that differed from what you found when you actually read it.
Yeah, this is a book we've been anticipating for quite some time. The series has spanned many years, and so its arrival has met with a lot of anticipation, certainly on my part as well. You know, like you said, it's a very Levenda-esque book. It's got his fingerprints on it pretty strongly. I also get the sense that this book adheres very strongly to the map that DeLonge and Levenda laid out for themselves many years ago when they sat down to think about what they wanted to say and how they were going to kind of space this message out over the course of these 3 books. So it's very much on message. What I was hoping for, and we'll get into some of the specifics. I know I was hoping for some maybe kind of weaving into this story more of the learnings that have come forth in the recent years, whereas I feel as if it almost just very rigidly still adheres to the primary objective that they set forth when they started the series many years ago. I mean, in some respect, I appreciate that. There's a message discipline there that they've adhered to, but I personally feel that the story lacked a little bit of the nuance that I wish that it had, incorporating some of the more recent developments and particularly incorporating, and we hear this a lot in the community, at least those who've been following this very closely, more of the information and experiences from those who are called experiencers, from people that have had up-close personal experiences of the phenomena. And I feel like that was acknowledged a little bit, but not necessarily woven very much into the story itself. So I'd be looking in a future iteration, maybe if there's a new series or some follow-on stories that come from Tom and Peter, that there would be some additional thought put into kind of bringing into this story the perspective of experiencers.
Well said, and I agree completely. And in these recent meetings I was a part of, one of the points I made was that some of the initial assumptions you make very quickly limit the possibility space of where it goes from there. And so I think we really have to be cautious about that, self-aware about that, be on the lookout for our biases, and really ask ourselves how much we can trust that we know certain things before we build an entire argument on that. And there are definitely times where Levenda seems to hint at certain things, point in a certain corner where certain things overlap, and basically conclude that this must mean something, and ask the reader to kind of go along with that process. I look at some of those things he's pointing towards, and while I do acknowledge there's some interesting synchronistic overlap, I don't necessarily draw the same conclusions he does. And again, the question is, what are they leaving out? To the point you just made, with the abduction aspect of the literature, they will definitely reference the shocking element, the discombobulating element, the apparent lack of free will and sovereignty for humans in that process, but not touch on at all any of the other worldview transformation that happens to people that is extremely positive, the ego death that leads to this transcendent understanding and a kind of noetic knowledge. None of that is touched on at all. And as you and I talked about privately, for a 600-plus page book, that seems like it's sorely lacking in terms of the overall analysis. But one thing they do well, I will say this, is that they set it up well. They talk about how this has to be a multidisciplinary kind of approach to get at this, and that they very much have the same perspective I do when I say this is the one topic that leaves no other topic unscathed. And they make a really compelling argument that we should actually, rather than just assuming our different academic traditions are solid and we should look at the phenomenon through those, Levenda actually makes the point we should do the opposite as well. We should use what we know of the phenomenon to look at some of our traditions, the way we sliced up knowledge and reality, and question whether or not that is well supported based on what we know of the phenomenon data. So I'm going to read from a section of the book now and then get you to riff on this in terms of addressing that very thing. Quote, "It is a fact of academic life in the United States and in many other countries that governments and the military are the only human institutions with the necessary economic resources to finance scientific research and development. Even corporations are funded by government grants and contracts that enable them to survive. This results in a relationship between governments, the military, and corporations that President Eisenhower famously characterized as the, quote, military-industrial complex, unquote. In fact, it is entirely possible that the power of governments is circumscribed by the military-industrial complex to the extent that control of information concerning the phenomenon is carefully monitored. Much of the late 20th century's serious research into the paranormal, for instance, was conducted in the United States under the auspices of the military and the intelligence agencies who had a serious interest in the weaponization of the paranormal. The same was true in Russia and China. This Cold War approach is noticeable in the engagement of the military, the CIA, and the FBI with the UFO phenomenon. In fact, they were often seen as interrelated, which is why we have grouped all these concepts under the general rubric of the phenomenon. As Dwight D. Eisenhower said in his farewell address, quote, "This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government," unquote. Now, before I go into the next section, where he talks about the need for a multidisciplinary approach, I'd like to get your take on that really relevant point, that so much of this is tied to the military in terms of how we've tried to engage with this topic, and that really government connected with the military is the only kind of institution that has the kind of funding to do this kind of research.
It's a really important point that he has made. I think that many of us are aware of this, certainly those of us who've been kind of in the trenches looking at this pretty closely over the last several years, but I think most people in the modern world understand this to be the case, certainly, that there's a collusion between the military budgets and powers and the industrial budgets and powers, that they are very much, they go hand in hand, that the biggest buckets of funding, kind of flow through those arteries. And as a result, the picture that emerges about what is consensus reality, right? And it's very, this book gets at the kind of the heart of the frameworks that we bring to this phenomena itself, and what shapes those frameworks, right? And Levenda, I think, making a case in many instances that maybe the frameworks are shaped by the phenomena itself, but also looking at these institutions. And we can recognize that much of the way in which we look at the world is determined by this military, industrial, commercial, capitalist kind of worldview. And you see that shift take place very markedly in the 20th century, right? You go from a United States that has emerged from a civil war and it's kind of becoming industrialized, and you have this growing country where there's this identity that is forming of a free people that are doing things and kind of just want to be left alone. There were a lot of isolationist tendencies prior to the world wars, but then these world wars kind of catalyzing this congealing of these institutions. Like, there's no way that we could participate in those conflicts if we weren't bringing all of our society to bear on that issue. And while that had a beneficial outcome, we would argue, in the case where we defeated Nazism, for example, we as a result of that effort, we've kind of, now that we've given birth to this new thing that's not necessarily all that democratic when you look at it closely, And so, here we are, the recipients of that model. And as I've said before on the show, when you're kind of in the military, right, when you're a hammer, everything is a nail. So when you look at the phenomena, you're always looking at it from a particular vantage point, and you're bringing your resources to bear to enforce that vantage point. And then whatever you determine about it and you disseminate that to the rest of us, well, it's going to take on the same characteristics. It's going to take on the same perspective that institution has given to the phenomena itself. And so we are the beneficiaries now of a very kind of a monocultural view of what the phenomenon might be. And I think everyone needs to take that into account when they're listening to any whistleblower who's coming from within one of those institutions, because that narrative, whether we like it or not, is shaping the conversation right now.
Yeah, very true. And I would argue, in addition to that we sometimes are sheltered from this understanding because we go to social media, for instance, where there's dialogues being had about the nature of the phenomenon. And we forget that because most of the information that's coming out is coming from these government sources, that it's already going to be slanted with the perspective you just described. So people might be led to believe that there must be a fair amount of a threat here because we keep talking about it with that perspective. But no, actually what we have is a situation where most of the information has been parsed and continues to leak from government sources, which are joined at the hip with the military-industrial complex. So, for instance, if academia had been more engaged historically, we would have more of a neutral perspective, just looking at it from a scientific point of view, perhaps. But what we actually have is infrastructure that is designed to identify and work against threats, to prepare for threats. So when that is the only perspective you have, then it's not a surprise that the conversation is going to primarily be revolving around that, not because the nature of the phenomenon itself suggests we should do that, but because that's the lens we're using. So this is something to be aware of for sure, not just in terms of how government thinks about this, but how it has shaped even the public conversation. And something that is really important to me that I've, again, made this point to other people at high level recently is that we might think we're just being pragmatic in sort of preparing for the worst, which is kind of what, again, DeLonge and Levenda kind of argue for as well. But because I believe that underlyingly life and reality is energetic, and these physical processes and structures are just the crystallized implications of that energetic undercurrent, because of that, I think it really matters how we talk about this, how we worry about this, how we seed our very reality with an expectation of what this phenomenon will be, especially when we think about the fact that there's a reflective aspect to this phenomenon. And again, this phenomenon is multifaceted. I found it interesting that DeLonge and Levenda choose to use the expression the phenomenon, capital P. That's what I tend to do as well. But of course, we should be aware all along that that might be hiding the fact that we have many elements that don't fit within conventional reductionistic scientism, basically, and that all that gets lumped together. So we have to be careful to identify patterns within patterns. But absolutely, how this has been framed and where the information has been coming from and who has had historically the funding to do this kind of research really has had an impact on how we talk about it. And I think we should be more cognizant of that. Right now, I want to get into the section of the book, which I think is really well stated, where they lobby for a multidisciplinary approach and really try to think outside the box in terms of how to grapple with this phenomenon. I quote, "It is hoped that this project will inspire a new generation of scientists, engineers, researchers, philosophers, psychologists, astronomers, geneticists, and artists, people from the hard sciences, the soft sciences, the humanities, and indeed from all walks of life, to reevaluate the evidence and to reimagine our society as a space that includes some of the seemingly fantastic and quote-unquote irrational elements of human experience, integrated with its more rational and familiar aspects in order to create new ways of understanding the complex matrix of knowledge and experience, of intellect and emotion, and of artistic and scientific creativity that we call reality. This work can be described as multivalent. That is, it involves discrete realms of knowledge that many may consider unrelated. This is deliberate. There will be some repetition, some backward and forward referencing, and other techniques designed to challenge our accepted paths to knowledge. Why? We feel that the UFO phenomenon represents a challenge to the Cartesian habit of diversification of knowledge into separate realms of matter, mind, and God. What we propose is a return to a kind of Renaissance understanding, not only of the UFO phenomenon specifically, but of the world in general, in which these realms are interdependent and permeable. In other words, we are asking to revisit our notion of reality completely. By doing so, we may find that the rather partisan perspectives of the UFO communities that focus on only one or two possible explanations of the phenomenon, most notably the extraterrestrial hypothesis, or ETH, do not adequately describe the true nature of the experience, which may be more holistic in terms of physics, biology, and consciousness than we suspect. This does not mean, however, that the phenomenon is necessarily benign. In fact, the only sensible approach may be to take a defensive posture, to assume a war footing, at least until all the facts are in. In the following pages, we will look at some of the options available to us, options that require a retooling of our understanding of defense and national and international security. Based on our conversations with members of the American military, intelligence, and industrial establishments, we will explain why there has been a need for secrecy where the UFO phenomenon is concerned, and why we are now at the stage where some of these secrets finally may be revealed. Unquote. Your thoughts on that section?
Well, I applaud what they're advocating for, that there should be a multidisciplinary approach. He uses the term intersectional, I think, toward the end of the book as well, trying to bring to bear all these different disciplines to understanding what the phenomena is. Of course, we've been championing that for a very long time, arguing that this is something that we need to be thinking about doing. I think the real challenge to that, though, and where I find the book struggles with this as well, it's sort of, and how could it not, right? Any of us are going to struggle with this, to be honest with you, because we have all inherited the paradigm of these kind of Renaissance disciplines about how to look at the world, right? We've inherited the structure that has broken the world into these pieces and said this is how we understand reality. And so when you're hearing an argument that says, well, we need to bring in all of these different disciplines and sciences and soft sciences and get all these people at the table and have the conversation. Well, part of the flaw in that effort, in that call to action, is that the disciplines themselves also have the same problems. Like that they are still looking at the world from that slice of perspective. And what I think you and I have tried to argue here is that we really need sort of an entirely new discipline and perspective that doesn't really exist at the moment. And that is one that tries to bring to bear the whole self to the experience, to the analysis of what the phenomena is, to recognize that human beings and the human experience is something that goes beyond the mere gathering of information and facts through the traditional means of analysis and data recording, but contains this what we would call kind of spiritual or emotional or dynamic human experience of reality. And so how difficult is it to bring people together to do that? And you find it, and Darren, you've had more experience with this than I have, but in the experiencer community and conversation, you have individuals who represent all of these cross-sections of society from these different disciplines, and they are struggling with how to incorporate the experience that they've had with their training of looking at the world from that disciplinary perspective. So here is the true challenge, and here's where I find that the book kind of struggles, because it is making this case that we should be doing this, but at the same time, it's relying on, one, the military perspective on whatever this might be, and then coming to a conclusion that to me isn't actually detached at all from a traditional perspective on what this might be, and is arguing that we should be, kind of guarding ourselves against a potential threat. That narrative shaped, largely by a very anthropomorphic perspective. So we've got some real challenges there, I think, to kind of cross into a new space that will yield some different results on what is happening.
I think that's well said, and I agree with you that I think the book lays out some promising ways of thinking about this phenomenon, but then doesn't quite live up to that in terms of its own approach and execution of that kind of thinking, and relies on the very thing that it points out is a certain narrow framing of the phenomenon. Now, they might argue that that's because there's nothing else available, but again, I would point to, and you pointed to, that experiencer testimony, if nothing else, is a major part of this. And there have been major surveys done. The Omega Project comes to mind, the free study that was done not too long ago, and I think eventually the project that I'm involved in with the Archives of the Impossible, which will also seek to recognize these overarching trends amongst experiencers, both in the Strieber archives and the MAC archives, I hope will be a key contribution to this conversation, because it is sorely lacking some additional elements that should frame how we think about the whole thing. Now, earlier on, I mentioned how I've been reminded of the fact that media, film, documentaries, series, and whatnot, will play a key role in the future acceptance and mainstreaming of this topic. Now, these guys get into how this has been framed previously in media and how that frames how we think about this as well. And I want to quote from that section now. Quote, "The field of ufology is replete with speculation concerning the intentions and capabilities of alien forces, even more than wondering about which star system they may have come from or their appearance or other characteristics. We have been conditioned in a way to think about the possibility of an alien invasion at least as early as H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds in the films like The Day the Earth Stood Still and Independence Day, among many others. Feel-good films about aliens include such optimistic offerings as Close Encounters of the Third Kind and E.T. These attempts at imagining what contact might be like between humans and some proposed other are useful, for this is a subject we should be thinking about and considering for a whole host of reasons. The tension between the alien as cuddly, quote-unquote, and the alien as evil, quote-unquote, is also useful, for it allows us to play off one against the other in a search for the most likely, the most reasonable, or at least possible outcome of human-alien contact. We should consider all possibilities and look at the problem from as many angles as possible. We can't do that if we are fixed in our attitudes and rigid in our thinking. We must remain open to any and every eventuality, calculate the possible outcomes, and come up with a strategy for each. Toward that end, and to our sisters and brothers in the bunker, this volume proposes to do the following. We will look at how some countries have addressed this problem with a focus on the United States, but including Russia and China as well. Within their own political and military environments and cultures, we will address some long-standing speculation in the UFO community where the possibility of human reverse-engineered alien technology is concerned. Specifically, the idea that the Nazis and or Soviets were involved in creating some of the craft that have been observed since the 1940s. We will put all of this in the context of the Second World War and the ensuing Cold War, and we will look at some of the personalities involved in the studying of the phenomenon. Finally, we will take a long, hard look at the idea of alien invasion and the wisdom of or folly of interpreting the alien from a threat analysis perspective, something that we have been accused of promoting. We will finish with a chapter that summarizes the main points of the study from a sociological perspective, albeit one that may owe more to science fiction than most would be comfortable entertaining. Your thoughts on that section?
Yeah, that's it comes to mind that you've got, let's take E.T., for example, run with that for a second here. So with E.T., you've got a story, and Close Encounters is this way too, to be honest, but you have stories that have raw experiences of the phenomena that are not mediated by a military governmental perspective. These are individuals who have experienced whatever this is up close and personal. And here I'm thinking too of DeLonge's film that I know didn't get a lot of attention, but the Monsters of California film that centered around these teens that had an experience of the phenomena, and then they come into conflict with the military as well. And so, the messaging that I get from these kinds of stories is one that's it has a high degree of tension, right? A tension between the individual's experience of what this is versus what the institutions are telling you it is, right? And that, I think, is something very prominent in kind of what we've observed taking place in recent times, as well as what we see in their description of governmental responses to what this is. And it's surprising. We get, to me, in some ways, ironic, because we kind of get our hackles up about the fact that the phenomena is really shaping our perception of the world. Well, to be honest with you, the military is shaping our perception of the phenomena, right? And so, we somehow, I don't know, have given them a pass in many regards. Like, a lot of the folks that are so excited about disclosure are leaning on perspectives of individuals who are proposing that it is something within a certain narrow band of possibility, right? And you have the more complicated sort of set of experience that falls in the individual experience of this. And what we've created a society, and we've spoken on this many times, we've created a society now where the individual's experience of reality is far less important than what the institution's experience of reality is. And it's important we think about that for a second, right? Whatever the institution is saying reality is, that's what we are saying is in fact real. And that the experiences that you have, I have, your family members have, we find those to be less reliable. I find that very fascinating, that we've kind of created a situation like that. So in some respects, the book does give a nod to that. It does pay attention to that, complexity. But as we've mentioned before, it tends to lean back toward, whatever the sort of anesthetized or sanitized version of this happens to be, and that comes primarily from these military perspectives.
Agreed. And something else I think about in that section was they go on to make the point that a movie like War of the Worlds is a little bit simplistic, because there's this notion that this immense threat evolves and emerges, but then we respond to it and we are triumphant. They make the argument that how do we know that that's not just the scout ships that are coming and there's an entire armada behind them, or numerous armada behind them, kind of thing. So they make the point that these Hollywood movies want to make us feel good at the end of the day, but in so doing, do a really poor job of describing the complexities and what might be on the back end of this. Now, what I would, again, say to them is that you're not holding up that same level of analysis and critique to the positive aspect, too, because they kind of point to something like E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind as these movies that were optimistic. But what I would want to argue is that this might ultimately be good and positive, even if it is complicated and not fuzzy and warm at first blush. So again, I think we have to be careful not to dismiss what can come from the abduction scenario just because it is initially startling and discombobulating. So what I would ask them to do is to spend as much time considering how might this be good ultimately for humanity, especially in light of the predicament we find ourselves in currently, with as much of a complicated lens open to different possibilities as they do to the threat narrative, where they say even things that don't initially look threatening might ultimately be. They talk about notions in the book like some sort of virus that infects humanity rather than armada of ships that are coming to shoot lasers at us. Fair point, but I would ask them to do the same for the positive possibilities, and they don't seem to do that so much. Now, one thing they did briefly reference in that section that I want to get into now, because this is a considerable part of the book and relates to Peter's work in Sinister Forces again, which is the Nazi overlap with this entire thing. And for those of us deeply embedded in this topic, we know that this has been part of the lore, that one of the X factors is that the Nazis were working on craft and technologies that at least might be an early version of something like a flying saucer. There's even been questions around what Kenneth Arnold saw that kicked off the entire modern UFO movement. Could that have been something the Nazis had created? They make the point that there's more evidence to support that notion than some might believe. So I want to dive into this section just because this is a huge part of the book, actually, in terms of the number of pages dedicated to this, and then get our takes on it. So this is the beginning of chapter 3. Quote, obviously, the idea that UFOs are of human design and or manufacture does not address the issue of UFO sightings taking place and recorded all over the world for millennia. The proposition that UFOs seen by Kenneth Arnold in 1947 had been manufactured in secret by Nazi engineers seems like a transparent attempt to dismiss all UFO sightings as representing some mixture of human engineering and ancient fairy tales. Yet there can be no general solution to the phenomenon that focuses on Nazi, German, or on any other modern human technology. However, one of the persistent rumors in some UFO circles is the idea that the Nazis had developed a flying saucer as a superweapon during World War II, or that they had manufactured them at a secret base in Antarctica, for example, after the war, and that this is the reason for the explosion of UFO sightings both during the war, the infamous Foo Fighters come to mind, and after the war, the Kenneth Arnold sightings and even the Roswell incident. It is apparent from the available U.S. military documents of the immediate post-war years that a belief in a Nazi flying saucer technology was taken quite seriously by the generals. The implication of this is obvious. The U.S. Army accepted that there was something to the flying saucer phenomenon, but they weren't sure whose it was. One gets the impression that they actually hoped it was a Nazi superweapon, for otherwise the conclusion that it was an alien technology was unacceptable. We will see there was every reason to believe that the Nazis had perfected some type of advanced aeronautical device, and that the idea that the craft witnessed by Kenneth Arnold over the Pacific Northwest was of Nazi manufacture was not so far-fetched. Objections raised by critics that the Nazis were incapable of financing and establishing laboratories and factories for the development of advanced technology after the war will be shown to be debatable. That there was an entire financial and technological infrastructure established by German firms abroad in the last months of the war will become clear. In some cases, we have the names of the firms and their locations, as well as indications of their financial strength. In other cases, we know of the engineers and the technologies developed. This was a continuation of war by other means." Unquote. So your take, sir, on the Nazi overlap with this topic?
Yeah, the Nazis, man, always good. Here, I think of my good friend Graham Rendell and all the work that he's done, kind of looking at this and researching this topic. I mean, I think Graham would roll his eyes a little bit on this. At least the research that he has done seems to indicate that this doesn't seem very likely. At the same time, I found it very fascinating that they go into great detail about the capabilities that the Nazi government had to potentially create craft, or at least to try to achieve an experimental craft. That the depth of their financial operations was really fascinating, and some of those details I wasn't aware of. The scope of the financial resources that they actually had, and of course we've all known about Operation Paperclip, but the true depth of that program, the sheer number of scientists that the United States acquired and also Russia acquired following the war. So it was very clear that the Germans had put a tremendous amount of effort into their war machine, and that included research into novel means of propulsion and that kind of thing. Whether they actually achieved that successfully, I think is still, in my opinion, pretty debatable. But it certainly kind of could lead to the argument that whether they had a breakthrough toward the end of the war, whether they had some sort of breakthroughs during the war that manifested in things that we saw or reports that we heard, Foo Fighters, etc. I mean, is it possible? I mean, certainly it's possible. But I still remain skeptical of the Nazi sort of tie-in to the UFO phenomena. All that said, the developments of technology that have emerged following the war, clearly we saw an explosion in rocket technology and the research that was conducted in the atom bomb. All of these kinds of things that would not have been possible without German science and engineering. So, is there a potential connection here to man-made UFOs? I think certainly it's possible. If it's true, Darren, I think you and I have touched on this before too, that the history of the 20th century deserves a significant rewrite. And it may very well be that is the case. And the things that we've all been taught or thought to believe could be incredibly wrong about what really took place during that conflict. And if you haven't read the books, I encourage you to kind of go into the more page turning and exciting literature that came out of the effort between A.J. Hartley and Tom DeLonge, the Sekret Machines, Chasing Shadows, and The Fire Within. I think those are the two stories, and there's rumored to be a third story that's coming out. But that gets into this same concept as well, that the Nazis had some technology, that it was acquired by the United States and taken back to the U.S., but Nazis also were able to escape and flee to countries like Argentina, which we know of, and then the Antarctic connection. The whole speculation about that, I forget what the name of the operation was, but the massive military operation to go down to Antarctica, there may have been some other purpose behind that beyond just exploring the continent.
Right, and one thing I want to point out here is that while they are exploring the notion that even the Kenneth Arnold sightings might have been Nazi technology, what we have learned from Kenneth Arnold's daughter since then is that, like Lou Elizondo, he and the family actually experienced orbs in their house in the days and weeks to follow. So I would just introduce that as another data point that we have to reconcile, because if this is truly Nazi technology, then do we believe that it's possible that they actually could also engineer this after effect and this psychological interplay and almost like a hitchhiker effect, that could actually be also an artifact of this technology? Or does that lead us to believe that actually is a data point moving away from the notion that this would be human technology? One other point I want to touch on before I go to this next section here, which will be our final section, delving into the Nazi connection, because it is a pretty big part of the book, is that, to your point, what Levenda argues, and he goes into this in an interview on Neon Galactic, which I would encourage people to check out, because he's asked directly, are you saying that the Nazis basically reconstituted themselves after World War II? And he said, no, and even the people within the military would never answer that question directly with a yes. But as you've alluded to, with Operation Paperclip, that involved thousands of Nazi scientists, including some high-level SS officers, being brought to the United States to basically carry on our rocket program. There were also, by the way, thousands, even more, even a higher number of Nazi scientists taken by the Soviets. So basically, the Nazi engine in terms of thinking and whatnot was injected into the U.S. infrastructure as well as into the Soviet Union. So his point is that if that has kind of got a rotten foundation, when you think about Nazi ideology and even kind of an occultic kind of perspective on the world, which I think he's absolutely right about that. There was an occultic beginning to Nazism. And I don't mean occult as in terms of like, that always means something dark and nefarious, but their particular flavor of occult was dark and nefarious and allowed them to believe, for instance, that they could execute Jews en masse by the millions because they were subhuman according to their notions of reality, which was basically occultic in thinking. So Levenda's point is that if that rotten foundation has been at the inception point for major developments in the United States and the Soviet Union, then we would see this carried on throughout the Cold War and whatnot. So this is something to be aware of, that it's not just him wishfully thinking that the Nazis maybe built out this huge empire in Antarctica. He's saying that it is a bit more difficult to pin down than that, but it ended up being introduced into the United States basically at the same time as the founding of the CIA. Even arguments that the way we began to think about intelligence in terms of agencies like the CIA was basically framed by a Nazi understanding of how to work with these things. So something to keep in mind. So I'm going to read this last one section that has to do with a Roswell connection potentially to the Nazis. We'll deal with that before we move on to the next element. Quote, the crash of a device in the New Mexico desert in the summer of 1947 caused a surge of excitement all over the United States, mostly because the Air Force's initial report was that a flying disc had crashed on some deserted land outside of Roswell, not far from an Army Air Force installation. The Air Force hurriedly amended that report, saying it was not a flying disc, but the wreckage of a weather balloon. We all know how that goes. It was a deception that fooled very few people, for how could the Air Force's own intelligence people mistake a balloon for a flying disc? Moreover, the local Air Force base was the headquarters of the squadron that had dropped the atomic bombs on Japan only 2 years earlier. These had to be some of the best and the brightest the Air Force could boast. The way this event was managed would prefigure how the military and the government would handle and mishandle the UFO phenomenon for the next 70 years. Only 5 years later, and UFOs would be spotted over the nation's capital, requiring an unprecedented press conference by Air Force generals to dispel any ideas that space aliens were visiting the planet. The officer in charge of the Roswell Army Airfield in 1947 was General Roger M. Ramey, who had quickly put an end to speculation that the Roswell craft was of a flying disc. It would be Ramey again who, on July 29, 1952, held a press conference in Washington, D.C. to debunk those UFO sightings. Science, the military, and the government itself began to run interference between civilian observations and the phenomenon. Science had become institutionalized, and as such was the sole arbiter of reality at the guidance of political and military expediency. The unforeseen consequence of von Karman's proposal to create a military-industrial complex was the usurpation of the truth, quote-unquote, by that complex. Indeed, the usurpation of legitimacy, reality, and even culture. What was detrimental to the smooth functioning of the complex was anathema. It was to be ridiculed, sidelined, or marginalized. When our source informed us that the device that crashed at Roswell in 1947 was a flying disc, and that it was manufactured or designed by the Nazis, we naturally had our doubts. We had heard stories like this for years, decades. It was the stuff of conspiracy theories, science fiction spoofs, like the Iron Sky movies, and pulp fiction. The problem for us was the source itself, otherwise impeccable and unimpeachable. We had to pay attention and consider the possibility this was the truth, unquote. So interesting nuggets there, both in terms of how Roswell framed how the military and the government would handle this topic with the public ongoingly throughout the 20th century into the 21st, but also, again, the potential Nazi overlap. So what do you reflect on when you hear that?
Yeah, well, it certainly was a turning point, July 1947, and not long after that, we had the formation of the Air Force and the CIA. So that the evidence seems to point to the need to create institutions that have that are better and more disciplined and being on message, and that perhaps that has a tie-in to whatever this happens to be. That when we have the Roswell crash and we have conflicting reports about what it is, we see them sort of circle the wagons and get on the same page when it comes to message discipline. And since then, we seem to have a little bit more of a clear machine that is doing that kind of same thing, that is creating strong message discipline about what it is that is actually taking place. And there are a lot of reasons for that that could be beyond, just the UFO angle. There are important reasons that the government needs to have a strong message discipline about what is taking place in its own territory with its own experimental craft. You tell your friends, you tell your enemies, of course, you reveal your hand if you're sharing something that is too transparent that you don't want your enemies to know that you're doing, or to know that about their own capabilities. And so, I can certainly see the argument here that it was important and remains important for the government to kind of be on the same page about whatever is taking place. The veracity of the claim that it's a Nazi craft, and of course, the quote that you read at the end of that quote, that they found it very difficult to dismiss out of hand this claim that it was a Nazi craft. It's certainly intriguing. I mean, I'm leaving space for this to be true. And I'm coming at it, of course, with an anti, it's the Nazis perspective. I feel like that narrative, for me, seems implausible. But again, I recognize that much of what we have been told about the real history of the 20th century is not exactly the case. And so this could be one of those secrets that would be incredibly damaging to the U.S., that the Nazis not only did we not defeat them, but they, were able to create these kinds of craft that do things that we can't do. And maybe there's a partnership with the Nazis. I mean, to Levenda's point that, Nazism on face was defeated, but the adherents of Nazism, the believers and the tenets of that ideology, it's not like they just like switched hats all of a sudden and were no longer Nazis when they became U.S. citizens and worked on these U.S. projects. I mean, their beliefs and perspectives on the world very much still rooted in a Nazi ideology, and how much of that ideology became the bedrock for some of our most powerful military industrial institutions, and how are those currents still present in some of those institutions when we may not be aware that they are a guiding force. I mean, that to use Levenda's own phrase, sinister forces, that is disturbing to think about, that the world that we think we operate within, that is seemingly founded on tenets of democracy and free agency and that kind of thing, that world is an illusion, that really we've got folks that have very nefarious ideas about mankind, humankind, and who should be here and who shouldn't be here, and those folks are kind of pulling the strings. It's a disturbing thought to consider.
Right, and what you just pointed to there, the sinister forces notion, I really want to highlight this because I tend to agree with you that I do leave open the possibility that a tiny fragment of the entire phenomenon might be involving Nazi vehicles, Nazi technology. But once we move on from that, what they're really underlining, and again, this is Levenda's thought, I think, more than DeLonge's thought, is that even the beginning of Nazism might have been fueled and inspired by these nefarious forces. And to your point about how 20th century history might be very different than we've been taught, and again, I've come across evidence suggesting that is the case, this is all wrapped up together. So we should make the point here that Levenda, and again, he's the chief person making the argument, I think, in these books, his perspective is that, yes, you need to look at the Nazi overlap, but even prior to that, how even movements like Nazism began, again, being more of an occultic kind of entity than a socio-political one, ultimately, is tied to these potentially nefarious forces, these sinister forces. So what he's basically laying out over many, many pages, out of these 600 pages plus, is the argument that all these seeming accidents of history might not be accidents after all, that the Kennedy assassination, the overlap between the rocket program and Nazis and occultic practices, the overlap with people like Jack Parsons, right, and how he had a connection to Aleister Crowley in addition to being involved in the cutting-edge rocket development in the U.S. So all of these overlaps, these synchronistic connections, Levenda is making the point that somehow they might all be connected. They might be being seeded from behind the scenes by these nefarious, sinister forces, and that this would be responsible for much of 20th century history going on to the 21st, where he would point out that the basic decline of civilization we've seen is basically being inspired by these forces, that they are anti-human and trying to ultimately undermine us, but they are doing it from behind the scenes. So again, there's a couple key points here before we get to the sort of final conclusion of the book, and that is, number one, that there are sinister forces ultimately behind this, and that the way that they do this is underhanded but difficult to pin down because it's always indirect, and it's inspiring humans who do certain things, form certain institutions and such, and that is what is ultimately causing the decline. Now, again, I just want to make the point that they are skewing towards looking at only certain kinds of data to support that notion. They are assuming that most of the evidence points to something negative and then postulating about what the nature of that negative force might be disembodied beyond space-time, but impacting people indirectly. Before we get to the final couple pages and how they conclude this book, just want to give you an opportunity to reflect on any of what I just said.
Yeah, it's clear to me that that they're having a difficult time, I think, disentangling some of their impulses in the book to kind of steer this conversation in a new direction, and disentangling that with the influence that they have, the perspective that they have been given from those that they would call their sources. And I recognize that's a tremendous challenge, right? You've got sources that know more than you, and why not take them at their word? But I'm very skeptical of the general approach because we hear a lot of folks that talk about this threat narrative, and we're talking about a non-human intelligence, and we make really dramatic assumptions about what that intelligence might think of humanity and how it might behave towards humanity. And most of the assumptions that we land on are actually pretty human. This is just some sort of dramatic and incredibly complex and powerful, essentially propaganda campaign that has been waged on the human race, since time immemorial, steering us in a particular direction, because that benefits the desires of this non-human intelligence in some long game that we're just completely blissfully unaware of. Is that possible? I mean, sure, it is. Does it sound like something we would love to do if we had the ability to do that and steer the opinions and ideas and thoughts of a civilization in a particular direction so that they become easy for us to conquer? Well, yeah, that sounds like pretty appealing, like something we would want to be able to do if we had the military ability to do that. But does it make it true? I don't know that it does. I think we really need to be very careful about that. And unfortunately, I don't think this book leaves a lot of room for that nuance that you and I would argue should be part of the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And I think both of us were hopeful that they might end the book a bit more open-endedly with different possibilities to consider. But the metaphor they use, the picture they describe to indicate what is involved here is quite limiting. I think we would both agree with that. But let's read this final section, just have our final thoughts on that in light of how they finish the book. Quote, "The attempt to characterize the others as benevolent is a brave, if perhaps misguided, strategy for coping with the emotional turmoil that those experiences produce. It also may be a purely intellectual position to take, understanding that we cannot presume to know what motivates a race of beings so different from ourselves, with a completely foreign worldview. The attempt to consider a human moral or ethical dimension to what is taking place is doomed from the outset. Thus we decide to err on the side of caution and entertain the possibility that the others mean us no harm. Unfortunately, that position results in an increase of our vulnerability and reduces our capacity to resist and therefore to survive. The only legitimate response to the alien abduction scenario, indeed to the phenomenon of the UFO sightings and experiences altogether, is to prepare for the worst and create a defensive strategy that is both top-down and bottom-out throughout our entire global culture, which involves recruiting specialists from every discipline in science and the humanities. This is because the phenomenon manifests itself in all of these areas. The literature on this subject is immense and includes everything from physical sightings and radar traces to psychological reactions, health, and medical issues. The establishment of religious movements based on contact, interference with weapon systems, etc. For that reason, a concerted effort by society is not only required, but must be reimagined to include under defense everything that makes human beings human. Common ground must be sought and found. Differences due to race, religion, history, culture, economics, and politics must be set aside the way that they are in times of war. Except that this time it is not war between countries on Earth, but between the entire globe and this invisible but no less tangible threat. In other words, the German philosophy of total war, put to use so effectively during World War II, needs to be re-engineered so that it represents an effort by the entire planet working in collaboration to defend itself against what might be, but is not necessarily, a threat against us all. Ironically, preparing for an intergalactic conflict may well be what is needed to ensure peace on Earth. The alien is indeed in the panopticon. The prisoners are starting to bang on the walls of their cells. If all the prisoners bang at the same rhythm at the same time, the walls of the panopticon will come tumbling down and the prisoners will rush the tower. Unquote. End of book. Your final thought.
Oh, yeah, it's so dramatic, right? Yeah, I mean, I wonder if we're not asking the right questions, and I totally get that this prepare for the worst and kind of hope for the best is essentially where this book lands. It very strongly lands in let's be prepared. But what if we in fact have already been doing that? And what if the governments that have been trying to study this have been bringing to bear lots of resources to understand this and prepare for the worst? And what if what we are witnessing right now are the consequences of that kind of preparation itself? That the things that we are hearing about in modern technology, military technology, are the fruits of that same kind of preparation. And that begs the question, is further preparation of the same perspective, from the same perspective, does it yield results that result in a peaceful human future? I'm not seeing evidence that we're moving in a direction that says that is the case. And so if that's where we are now, I don't expect we're going to just be able to continue doing that and end up in a different place at the end. And so I would argue maybe we need to start changing the approach entirely. And I get it; that's a very difficult thing to do. But if you take a different perspective, and they mention this, in the book, this sort of colonialism, and that you had the European powers that enslaved these native cultures, and totally changed the way that they looked at themselves and kind of obliterated their own histories in the process. Like these are horrible, the horrible legacy of colonialism, and it's very, very powerful. But let's not forget that human civilizations have had a lot of different manifestations in history. And just because we have one manifestation of it right now that is sort of the child of these colonialist instincts, doesn't mean that that's the civilization that is best for humanity, or it doesn't mean that that's the lens by which we should be looking at this at all. Maybe we need to take the approach of some of these indigenous cultures and look at how they viewed themselves, both as individuals, as societies, as collectives, their relationship between each other and their relationship with the world, that these kinds of different dynamic perspectives on the nature of reality that those cultures, some of them had, that maybe those perspectives are the perspectives we would want to bring toward whatever this is. And that, as you and I have often talked about, whatever we are putting into the world, whatever we are manifesting into the world with our framework, that's what we get back. And so essentially arguing that we need to continue to basically militarize and get even just better militarized through the inclusion of more disciplinary approaches, that's somehow going to result in a peaceful outcome, to me seems incredibly misguided. So I appreciate the effort. I think it does raise some very important questions and introduce some very thought-provoking aspects to the history of what this is. But I personally think that it's still going in a direction that isn't going to change the result of the path that we're currently on. And to have a dramatically different outcome, we have to have a dramatically different approach. And I don't know if we're ready for that. You and I have talked a lot about that. Is the world ready for that? Are we really creating a culture and a soil, a furtive soil where we can have a different reality? I don't know that we're doing that. And what would it take for us to begin changing to where we could have a different sort of mix of ingredients and nutrients to yield a different future for human civilization? What would it take to get there? I don't know if we can do it on our own. We certainly are reaching, I think, a point of convergence, to steal your phrase, where we're going to have to make some very hard choices about our future.
Indeed. And again, I think we both would highlight the sense that the scope of this project was compelling and inspirational. The execution left a little bit to be desired, I guess is what we would say. And again, I would underline what I mentioned earlier, which was part of the meetings I had recently, was the sense that the early assumptions we make quickly reduce the possibility space. So the challenge is, even though this is a 600-plus page book, the premises that they lay out early on ultimately determine all of the possibility space they can explore from then on. And none of it is particularly inspiring or hopeful. And even at the end there in that section I just read, he basically is implying that this notion that this could be friendly and for our net benefit is kind of like an example of Stockholm Syndrome. He doesn't use that expression or that phrase exactly, but he's kind of hinting at that, right? This notion that basically when you have no power and your agency has been robbed, you will actually switch your allegiance to your abductors, to your captors, so that you feel like you can regain some sense of agency, but it's a misguided process, basically. That the truth of the matter is that this is a foolhardy way of trying to attempt to retrieve some sense of agency. The thing is, I don't think the data supports that notion. People often will say to me, this comes up a lot, if these beings are so powerful and they can control our perception, they can even induce emotional responses like love, how do we know that itself is not just a tool by some nefarious force to make us pliable? But when you read the context of all these accounts, how these beings go out of their way to help people understand the nature of reality, understand their own potential, they help them work with the mind to work with three-dimensional objects and to do things like steer the ship, run the craft, basically using their mind from a young age on up into adulthood. So even if they are, for instance, part of the abduction program in the teen years where they are sexually mature and then genetic material is taken in order to accomplish this hybridization project, well before then, they are being inspired, their possibility space is being expanded, their worldview is being expanded, that even as young children, they begin to experience with much more depth and breadth than is taught to us in our conventional culture. So if it was true that these were just nefarious forces trying to do as little as possible to get us to where they want us, that doesn't play well with the data itself, which again tells me that in many of these circles, the abduction literature, the experiential literature is sorely lacking as a key element of data to understand what's going on here. I would argue that, as I pointed out earlier, it really matters how we seed the context. And if we have only a defensive posture of what could go wrong, then that's going to impact reality itself. And if you were some sort of sophisticated alien intelligence that wanted to welcome a younger species into the Galactic Confederation, if you will, with open arms and open hearts, you might hesitate if you see that society, that civilization, still posturing for war, still assuming that anything unknown that does some things that stretch our understanding might be and should best be perceived as a threat. That in itself says something about us that I think might determine what happens here. I would ask all of us to reconsider some of our assumptions and think about what possibility spaces that opens up, and remind ourselves that a military framing is inevitably going to reduce that possibility space. And I think what you and I try to do on this podcast, and many others are doing the same thing, is try to describe a hopeful future and how the data itself from this phenomenon, in line with the experiential literature, actually points to that particular hopeful outcome, and we can actually help embody that so it's much more likely to happen than not.
Well said. It's great to be back in this conversation. We could go on this for a long time. It's a very thought-provoking book. I encourage folks to pick it up and engage with the content on it. We're going to continue doing that as well, I'm sure, across future shows as we move forward in this conversation, and maybe provide a little bit of a counterbalance or a counter-argument to what we might say is a different approach. And that's something I wish the book would have done, maybe is say, look, that yes, we can take a defensive posture, but maybe we should also, in parallel, create a posture that isn't that, and that would then best prepare us for maybe either outcome. And instead, if we just put all of our eggs in a defensive posture, we will be very malformed in our ability to come at it with that kind of benevolent or just alternative perspective. So again, thanks everyone for listening. Good to be back with y'all. Looking forward to get back on our regular schedule. So we'll be back with everyone in the next 3 weeks on Liminal Phrames. And we'll see you out there in the community. Please drop us a like and a subscribe and a comment. We love getting the comments. And you sharing this podcast with others is a great honor to both of us. And we thank you for your loyal support. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.